Hello, what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron, and today we are taking a look at some wild predictions and wild assertions, some projections, some opinions about what could possibly captivate us as players and captivate GGG to develop over the next several months in the life cycle of Path of Exile after patch 3.7. So we're all very aware up until this point. We're only a few weeks away from the announcement about what 3.7 is going to be all about, and of course we're going to be covering that here on the channel. But we're very, very close to all of the information that's going to be coming out about the Melee updates and the Melee reworks that are coming with patch 3.7 and the league that's associated with that. So what we wanted to do here in this video is talk about and project out some future possibilities for POE during the release cycles that happen after 3.7. One of the reasons why this came up as a topic is because we kind of knew a little bit about 3.7 and were able to project out a little bit about 3.7 as soon as we learned about patch 3.6 and all of the different spell updates that were going to come out and changes to the passive tree and kind of design goals that were going on behind there with 3.6. It was basically a foregone conclusion that, hey, 3.6 was going to come along and changes were going to happen for spellcasters, and then at some point down the road changes would happen for attack-based users, specifically melee users. And so 3.6 and 3.7 have kind of been attached or married together as a pairing. And so what we want to do today is jump ahead and give some opinions about what could 3.8, 3.9, 3.10, and if there's any other patch cycles, what those could be like pre-4.0. Those of you who are veterans to the channel, you know the deal around here. But if you're new, welcome to the channel. You can give us a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you'd like to be notified about more discussions and videos just like this one. There is a timestamp that is placed for your convenience on the right hand side of the video. You can go ahead and jump to any of those hot link timestamps down below in the video description if you'd like to. Those timestamps are placed directly above my slightly balding forehead. So let's jump right into our table of contents. What are we going to be talking about today? Primarily three different things. First off, what has POE been doing in recent mechanics, and what has the focus been over the last year or so in POE development and in gameplay content that's come out? Then secondly, what problems or new challenges have recent mechanics tackled, or maybe have they introduced? And then thirdly, projecting the future of POE beyond 3.7. So let's jump right in. So what has POE been doing of late? Well, on a macro level, the big picture level about league mechanics that get introduced. We're talking big picture, 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet, looking at the game in its widest lens possible, the biggest goals that they've wanted to tackle. And we see through the last several development cycles in Bestiary last year in 2018 during the Spring League, it was a variety crafting league that introduced for us Einhar as a master as well as beast crafting, which wasn't necessarily endgame focused. There were endgame aspects to it, but there was a wide variety of crafting recipes that were introduced early on, relatively early on into the game, that could be beneficial to the players early on. And it was really interesting to see the reception of that league, both how poorly it was received, but also the intentions behind it. That there was at least one goal that GGG had in mind, which was easing more players into crafting, getting more players into crafting, so that way eventually more players could move in their educational experience in Path of Exile from new player to intermediate player to endgame crafting experience. And so Bestiary was a way for them to get at that goal. It was a variety crafting league where lots of different players from lots of different crafting experiences, whether you were new or whether you were a veteran, could get into crafting and learn something new and experiencing something new with crafting. Now, Incursion was a little bit different of a league. It really was more focused on endgame crafting at its top tier. We're talking a lot of different mechanics for grabbing legacy items, as well as for taking top end gear, and rather than simply single corrupting it, you could now double corrupt it, which was highly risk reward oriented, was very, very much geared towards players who had the currency to potentially poof an item where it could simply go away. You had to have enough currency to make that valuable or make that doable if you could survive a hit like that. Or if you hit the jackpot, conversely, you could then play with that particular item in that particular build, or sell it and flip it and make a ton of currency. It was also really a start of a trend of what we've now seeing. None of us, at least here in the G3 community, recognized this as a trend during Incursion itself. We didn't predict this last year, but now we can look back and see that this was an intentional start of an encounter cycle development that GGG was going to be putting in place, where they introduced Alva as a master, but they also wanted to introduce the concept of us leaving the zone that we were in. This is something that we've had a little bit of in the past, specifically with Harbingers and Abyss. So a little bit of leaving the zone that you're in, introduced through a league mechanic, but not necessarily on a time cycle. And Incursion, with your 11 different temple experiences in order to build up your temple, really started the encounter cycle experience for us inside Path of Exile. If you want to debate me on that and say it started earlier than that, that's fine. I'm happy to have a history discussion with you, so leave me a comment down below if I'm missing something. But Incursion, at least for this most recent year, really started us with this heavy encounter cycle where we would leave a particular instance that we were in, go and encounter and play a mini game, which was the temple, and then come back to our original zone if we survived that mini game. Incursion was the start of that, and that would become a recurring theme over the last year. Then we got Delve League, which was, of course, new crafting, lots of different options with Delve fossils as well as with Delve stats that got added onto items. And then we got a bunch of endgame content that got added. Delve essentially added this layer to the game that said, okay, if you really want to push yourself and push your build to how far it can go inside this game space, Delve is now the place for you to go out and try that. So it introduced a ton of endgame content. It really introduced another competitive level and competitive layer to Path of Exile, where there's the racing scene in Path of Exile, but now there is also the Delve scene in Path of Exile, where players are constantly competing in different types of leagues to see how far they can push their build. And another master was introduced, Nico. Then we got Betrayal, which was a massive crafting rework and a master rework, all encompassed together. And then it also really hyped up the encounter cycle. So we saw out of really 3 out of the last years worth of 4 content releases for leagues in 2018 that most things were focused on this encounter cycle, where you would go and do something for a little bit, play a little mini game. There would be some sort of cap on it, whether that was encounters for Alva temples, whether that was soul fight for Delves, or whether that was a betrayal board for Betrayal. There was some sort of encounter cycle and encounter mini game that was going on that you had to pay attention to on top of the particular zone that you were already in. And Betrayal took this to a whole new level. A bunch of players loved it. A bunch of players hated it. It was in game design, and at least in game design theory, exactly what you want. It's very, very polarizing. And at the particular time, because there was a confluence of a lot of different factors in gaming, including phrases such as, don't you guys have phones? Those things all, came together at the same time, and Betrayal blew up, and it was one of the most played times in Path of Exile history. Then we've gotten Synthesis. Synthesis has added in top-end crafting, and a lot of players, again, it's a very polarizing league. A lot of players have hated it and been vocal about it, vocal enough to the point that Synthesis is not coming back. It's not going core at the moment. Chris has said there's no plans in the moment to make it core. And it also continued with this encounter cycle where you had a static amount of memories that you could keep. Eventually, you would have to run them and go play the mini-game. Alongside that, Cavus was introduced as an endgame character, and it's interesting to note here that there's actually some parallels between Bestiary and Synthesis, because neither of them were immediately coming back, but the difference being last year's development cycle, 2018, we had Bestiary, Incursion, Delve, and Betrayal all do something that was tied together with a master rework, and so they were very clearly committed to the master rework, to rolling that out with Betrayal. I'm not sure if that's something that we're going to be able to look back in a year from now and say, yes, GGG was really committed to Cavus and to other characters like him and to adding him into the game. He's got a lot of storylines, and a lot of players have pointed out that because Cavus has had so many storylines, he probably will be coming back. That's a pretty big investment on the company's part to not use in the future in terms of assets, but we'll see exactly what that looks like moving forward. So this is what POE has been doing on a macro level. On a micro level, of course, every single league, there's new uniques, and you can think of new uniques over the last year that you've found and that you've enjoyed. You can think of new divination cards that have come out. Most popularly, at least most recently, that I was target farming was the Nurse, which, was a mini doctor, which of course eventually gets you a headhunter. So there's lots of little updates that come out all the time, whether that's new supporter uniques or just new uniques that the game wants to, that the game developers themselves want to design. New divination cards that are coming out. Again, supporters play a big part in that, but also in-game economic needs are also met through that, whether that's through new breach cards that come out, whether that's through new Abyss cards that come out, whether that's through new Bestiary cards that come out, whether that's through new Delve cards that come out. New divination cards are just a part of the micro experience of what PoE pretty much constantly does with every single patch and with every single content update. New skills is another thing. New skills have really taken on a life of their own, particularly in relationship with how skills are getting buffed and changed. And so oftentimes we're seeing pairs or parallels between skills that are getting released and then skills that are getting tweaked. So if a skill is getting tweaked and maybe a new skill is coming out that would take over that kind of same design space, then maybe the old skill is getting tweaked and kind of is a second version of a almost a lesser new skill to an extent, where it feels like it's a totally new skill unto itself. It doesn't necessarily have the same feel to it. Or conversely, the opposite can happen. A new skill comes in and takes over a totally new space, and a skill that wouldn't have anything to do with that particular space actually moves a little bit closer towards that design space in philosophy, maybe because that's what GGG wants to push the game towards, or maybe it's because there's simply tools that are available on the developer side to make a skill more like what they wanted it to be in the origin of the game, but they couldn't do it at the beginning of the game for whatever technical reason, and now they can do that because of the advent of maybe more manpower or maybe technology on the back end. Also, the Atlas reshuffling is now a league-by-league thing. I debated putting this in the macro section, but to me it's just a micro thing now. Yes, it's a pretty big shakeup to the map Atlas strategy every single time, but because this is now an every league thing, it's not a special, hey, this is a macro level decision. Oh, this is a big deal, we're changing the Atlas now. No, this is just like an every league thing. They've said they're going to shuffle the Atlas. It's going to happen. It's an every league thing now. Adding endgame bosses is a pretty common thing now. Every single content release for each league that has come out that we just went over has added endgame bosses. And back in 2015, 2016, and even 2017, a lot of the complaints that were coming out of the community was that there's just not enough stuff to do in the endgame in Path of Exile. Believe it or not, a lot of you are newer players over the last year and a half, and so that's totally fine. You might be saying, there wasn't enough to do in the endgame. Well, just imagine a world where there's only Shaper. And I'm not talking about Uber Elder. I'm not talking about Elder. I'm saying just Shaper. There's Shaper, and there's Aziri and Uber Aziri, and that's it. Right? So that's a completely different world. And so there was a point in time in Path of Exile's existence, and even pre-maps, right, where people were doing Piety and Dominus runs. I mean, that's a thing. So again, I don't want to go back in the Wayback Machine, but that was a thing. And so now it's a pretty regular thing with every new league that comes out that there's going to be endgame bosses added. So we can probably assume that that's going to happen moving forward as well. And then, of course, passive tweaks. You can look at the diagram here that Paint has provided for us. You can basically break the passive tree down and say, look, 3.6 was tweaks to the passive tree above the red line, and 3.7 is most likely going to be tweaks to the passive tree below the red line. Now, maybe there's going to be some overlaps and maybe some tweaks here and there that don't necessarily follow that strict line. But for the most part, 3.6 was focused on spellcasters, on their ascendancies, as well as the passive tree that surrounds spells. And then 3.7 is going to be around melee and the ascendancies that are melee and the passives that are around melee. So that's what PoE has been doing. Okay, so what problems or new challenges have recent mechanics tackled? This is our second topic for the day, or our second point. And really over the last year, there's been a lot of confusion that has been introduced. PoE has tried to tackle this, and I mentioned this earlier in the video. Bestiary, I think, was GGG's attempt to bring newer players along in crafting, not just at a high level or at a high end of crafting, but at an introductory level. As soon as you could start collecting beasts, you could essentially go to the menagerie, start slaughtering them, and start putting them to good use. Whether that was for flasks, because you needed a particular flask, maybe you need an anti-freeze flask at the start of the league, maybe you need a basalt flask at the start of the league, maybe you need simply a flask to remove bleeding to go fight Dominus in Act 3. There's lots of different things that early on beasts could do for you that were introduced with Bestiary. We've also seen this happen with, in terms of this emphasis on introducing people into crafting with Delve, how early on in the Delve League, it was very, very popular for people to do low-level Delve darkness or darkness delving, where they would simply run around and grab fossils and either use them for themselves or sell them on the market. So there was an incredible availability for players to try out crafting, both in Bestiary as well as in the Delve League. And of course, in Betrayal League, there was a whole bunch of different crafting benches and crafting reworks that got made to the game. And the game is much more friendly now about unlocking and allowing you to interact with recipes by having those recipes be out in the world. And so you're rewarded by actually playing the game and going out and interacting with the recipes in the world. Not a lot of veteran players necessarily like that. A lot of people that I've actually interacted with over the last several months since Betrayal has come out actually have said we prefer the old master system better. That's fine. If you've got a particular preference, feel free to leave a comment down below. I simply want to say for newer players, it's a heck of a lot more intuitive to run into a zone and to click on a thing and say, hey, I've now got that recipe, than to say, oh, this particular master, I have to go and do their missions. Yes, that might be a cool mechanic, but intuitively, clicking on something is a lot faster than going and following somebody around for a mission. And, let's not even get into Varici and Katarina missions anymore, okay? Thank God those are a thing of the past. But anyway, also there's been a lot of confusion about progression. Speaking of masters, how to progress masters, how to progress with your crafting, how to progress with your dailies on those masters, how to efficiently do those, how to rotate those on your atlas, and how to efficiently cycle through them in order to be efficient. There's a lot of confusion about progression in Path of Exile to begin with, especially even going through the act story, the 10-act story of Path of Exile. There's a lot of confusion about how to progress your character. A lot of players aren't sure about what quests are optional, what quests are mandatory, what's the best ways to level up, what's the best ways in terms of thresholds to hit for different acts. There's lots of questions and lots of complex systems that are going on at the same time simultaneously in Path of Exile. That's one of the things that we all love about Path of Exile. It's one of the things that keeps us playing Path of Exile is the amount of layers that Path of Exile has. Path of Exile, it's a little bit like an ogre. Ogres are like onions, right? They have layers. Well, Path of Exile is a little bit like an onion. It's got a ton of layers to it, and we all love that about Path of Exile. But it can be very confusing in terms of progressing your character, progressing your atlas, progressing your endgame goals, progressing side content, progressing your masters, progressing your crafting, progressing dailies. These can be things that new players can and often do get overwhelmed with. And so this is a problem, but this is also something that recent leagues have tried to tackle. Interruptions are something that are a hot button topic right now. We're not going to get into all of the different interruptions that people are complaining about, but I will simply say people are talking a lot about game flow, and people are talking a lot about sessionable content, how people can sit down, how a person can sit down for a session of Path of Exile. And it used to be that you'd go and you'd run a bunch of maps, and maybe there would be a Zana mission here, maybe there would be an optional master mission here, maybe there would be an optional piece of league mechanic that you might want to interact with, or previous league mechanic that you might want to interact with, but you could choose not to interact with it if you didn't want to. But nowadays, people feel like they're being interrupted in their game flow because they feel like they will be hurt in their gameplay if they're not progressing their masters when they interact with them, if they're not following through on missions, or conversely, if they are not playing with those masters at the highest, most efficient level, i.e. using scarabs or doing rotas for various types of content in order to rush that content, or looking for ways to game a system, like when Incursion Temples first came out and people figured out how to game some of those rooms and some of those systems on the Alva spawns. So people now feel like they're getting interrupted when they're sitting down to play a game, a session of Path of Exile. They feel like these things that are happening are no longer optional content that add something to their gaming experience, but rather they feel like their gaming experience is going great, but if they don't do this other thing, they feel like they're losing out. So they don't feel like they're having something additional added to their gameplay experience. They feel like they're losing out if they don't interact with the content, and that just feels like homework. It feels like chores, and frankly, it feels like a lot of other MMORPGs that are out there on the market right now that a lot of people don't want to do internet chores. A lot of people don't necessarily want to come home and do internet chores when they turn on Path of Exile and play an action RPG. We want to go and build a character and experience the world inside that action RPG in all of the different ways that we choose to. Notice choose. And so agency is another big thing that people are talking about. Zana is another great example of interruptions. It used to be that Zanaceptions would happen where you'd say, okay, it's kind of a meme inside the Path of Exile community to say, oh man, I would just do one more map and then I'm going to head to bed, or one more map and then I'm going to head to class, or one more map and then I'm going to head to work. And then you'd bump into a Zana, and Zana would maybe have a master mission for you. And so you'd be in a map, then you'd be in another map, and then you'd have to complete another master's mission, and maybe that master's mission would send you into another zone. And so then you'd finish that master's mission inside the zone, which would then take you back out to the master, who then would take you back out to Zana, who then would take you back out to the map, and then you'd be like, whoa, this is amazing, look at all of this extra content that I just got. Well, that's no longer going to happen now. And so those optional chosen dive-in rabbit holes in, Zanaceptions that maybe the Path of Exile community actually has come to love over the years are no longer going to be there. So the interruptions that we have welcomed and grown to appreciate and have turned into memes are no longer necessarily there. And the interruptions that we don't necessarily like, that are interacting with agency or player agency or perceived player agency, are happening more and more. So these seem to be some of the problems and some of the challenges that GGG is trying to tackle, but are also getting introduced with the new sorts of content that's been brought out and been innovated by GGG over the last year. Well, our third point and third section today is actually projecting the future of POE. So here's some wild, bold predictions based on some information that we've already got. So we already know that there's going to be a development timeline, probably rotating around the same amount of schedules that we've had for the last several years with Path of Exile. 3.7 is probably going to come out in June 2019. 3.8 is probably going to come out around August or September of 2019. 3.9 probably in November, December. And then 3.10 probably February, March. There may be some changes here or there. Those might be off by a month or so, but that's probably the schedule that we're looking at. This was a recent response in one of the developer Q&As that I think is very, very helpful for us as we think about projecting the future of Path of Exile. You must have some vague plans on what development will look like after 4.0. Are we going to see any major changes to how things are running? Answer: all our efforts are focused on 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, 3.10, and any other expansions leading up to and including 4.0. We plan to tackle what the post 4.0 world looks like when we get to it. So the first thing that I want to say right here, projecting beyond 3.7, is that we don't yet have a date for 4.0. Okay, so as we're talking about 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, 3.10, notice that there's that caveat, and any other expansions leading up to and including 4.0. So it's possible that there will be a 3.11. It's possible that there will be a 3.12. We will see. There's probably several different factors that are in play. At least a couple of factors that can come to mind is whether or not Diablo 4 gets announced at any particular point in time. I think that probably if it does get announced, if there's a release date that's given for Diablo 4, then that is going to give Grinding Gear Games and Path of Exile a moment to take a deep breath and then compare what they've already developed with what Diablo 4 is at least promising, or in practice of sales of the hype train is at least selling itself as. So I think this is one of the reasons why we don't have a date for 4.0 yet, a hard date. Not just because, yes, there's a ton of work going on the back end, and so we don't have firm dates on that yet, but because there's a bunch of different competitors, namely one of the bigger ones in the business, Blizzard, that potentially could be coming out with a major competing game over the next several years. And so GGG doesn't want to tip their hand and show something too early when they don't have to, and there's no need to at this point in time. So that's our development schedule right now, is that potentially we've got at least 3.10 coming in the spring of 2020, and then 4.0 could come anywhere from summer 2020 all the way through, who knows, maybe not even until 2021. We'll have to wait and see. Now, there is a second question here that is also very, very helpful, and a second answer that's even more helpful than the question. When a new league is in development, is it designed for it to be implemented into the core game? Answer: not always. For Bestiary, Incursion, Delve, and Betrayal, we had a specific plan to put them in the game together with the 3.5 release. Most leagues are assessed after we've had a chance to see how the community feels about them. This is an open admission that 3.5 and that entire development cycle that we just talked about, for the last year, we're talking Bestiary, Incursion, Delve, and Betrayal. All of those leagues were tied together. They were all in their development cycle and in their conception. They were all tied together to be working together towards the master rework. They were from day one of the drawing board, all going to go core together because they were all going to be a part of the master rework. We do not necessarily have that in play right now for 3.7 and beyond. This was why when I said, hey, there's a bunch of voice lines for Cavis, but we're not sure if Cavis is going to go core, and we're not sure if there's going to be a bunch of other, side characters like Cavis that get added into the game with a bunch of extra voice acting in 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, and 3.10. The reason why we're unsure about that is precisely because of this line. We're returning to the days when Path of Exile isn't necessarily designing an entire year's chunk worth of content with a single overarching goal, i.e. last year reworking Masters, as the design principle and as the design philosophy. We're no longer in that space. The space that we are clearly in, from the 2 development Q&As, is a space where GGG is focused on making sure that they can retain players and build a player base leading up to 4.0. So this means that right off the bat, we're probably going to be departing from a bunch of different leagues that have got a bunch of different mini games. So mini games like Bestiary that has a mini game and a side attachment area to it. Mini games like Incursion that pulls us out of a zone and has a mini game attached to it. Minigames like Betrayal that have got an entire board and that are character account bound to them. Those sorts of levels of minigames that have gone on, even like Synthesis, where it was a minigame that was really hated by a lot of the community, a vocal amount of the community hated that minigame. Even those members of the community that liked Synthesis and hoped it went core, I hoped it went core because of the crafting aspects. I wasn't enthralled in any way, shape, or form with the minigame of the encounters with Cavis or with the minigame of the Memory Nexus. It simply didn't necessarily feel like it added something to the game that I had to go rush or that I felt like I was really excited to go and do when I was sitting down for a gameplay session of Path of Exile. So that's the space that we're in right now. Those mini games are probably getting pushed to the side, and at least my intuition, my gut, and what I'm saying here, projecting moving forward with POE, is that probably we're going to see a return to league mechanics like strong boxes, like essences, like breaches, and like abysses, i.e. optional content that if you don't click on it or you don't walk over it, it won't necessarily spawn anything, and it's something that will add something to the zone that you are already in. It will not take you out or require you to play a mini game in order to feel like you are fully engaging with the league mechanic. It could be something like Breach or Abyss, where yes, there are side areas that you can go to and side bosses that you can explore and interact with, and even introduce new currency like Harbingers, or even interact with new sorts of monsters and roles that get added into the game, whether that's like Essence. But I think those are all going to be optional things that are added to the gameplay experience of a particular zone that you're already in, not something that's going to pull you away from your gameplay flow. I think that's something that GGG is probably looking at and saying, we're going to focus on any kind of minigame stuff that we're going to add. We're going to save that for 4.0. Right now, we're just going to focus on retaining players and growing our player base as we prepare for the eventual release of 4.0. Now, moving on. These two answers to these two questions also help us at present understand that there isn't this overarching goal like the master rework, right? So if there is no overarching goal, it means that each of these leagues, like we just said, if they're going to be more independent of one another, there's not one single overarching design philosophy or content philosophy that has to be grinded together and made into a cohesive game plan or cohesive patch or cohesive even gameplay mechanic. That means that there's actually a lot more freedom. Okay, so those of you that may have just heard what I just said and say, oh man, there's no big plan and no big overarching thing, oh, that's kind of a bummer, so what are we going to be doing? Like, they just want to focus on player retention? You know, those of you that are upset with that, and, oh, Iron, they're just focused on player retention now and getting new players, so you're telling me they're just kind of be sitting in neutral, like waiting for 4.0? Oh man, this sucks. Iron, I think that's a terrible vision. Don't hear what I'm not saying. Okay, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm saying this actually allows for a bunch of design freedom because they don't have to say, okay, how does 3.7 interact with 3.8, which leads into 3.9, which eventually will reveal all of our master plan for 3.10. They don't have to do that now. They can just say, hey, what's the most fun way that we can make this awesome mechanic present for the next 3 months? We'll see if the league likes it. We'll see if the players like it. We'll see if the community likes it. We don't have to be overly attached to it. Let's see if this thing works or not. And it might work, it might not. Some of the best and most fun concepts in Path of Exile in terms of currency, in terms of zones to play in, and in terms of gameplay mechanics to interact with are Breach, our Essence, our Abyss, our Harbinger. These add currency, these add bosses, these add zones, these add crafting, these add items, these add gameplay options for solo as well as group play. There's lots of stuff that's there. By no means am I saying that the last year has sucked. In fact, I'm on record several times as saying the last year I think has been the best year of GGG's design thus far. I think it's been their best year. Nonetheless, there's a lot of freedom in getting to say we just need to make the best league we can for these 3 months and not having to work with another team or with an overarching goal that says, hey, what are we doing and how is this plugging into a bigger picture? That's a lot of freedom. So at present, since there's no overarching goal, we actually may start to see some things phase out. We may actually start to see some league mechanics get phased out of the game, whether that's Tormented Spirits, whether that's Beyonders, whether that's other things like strong boxes or essences, maybe potentially. We may actually see different league mechanics that have been implemented into the core get rotated out over the next several leagues. So don't be surprised if you see that. Again, that might be something that we all hate, but the reason why they may rotate it is because they might have a design space that's actually very similar already to a core principle or to a core mechanic that's already involved and is a little bit too close to home to another type of gameplay mechanic, and so they may actually remove that mechanic entirely in order to improve it. Imagine if they took out, let's say, Rogue Exiles because they really wanted to buff them or change them or have some other sort of gameplay that was similar to Rogue Exiles but wasn't Rogue Exiles themselves. Or imagine if they wanted to rework strong boxes, or imagine if they wanted to rework essences. You can see what I'm saying here. Hopefully, if you can't, feel free to ask a question and I'll try to clarify more in the comments. But it could be that they've got similar ideas and concepts that they didn't get to use back in the day when they originally released a gameplay mechanic via a league mechanic. And so now they want to revisit that and revamp it and then release it and see how it goes over. And if it doesn't go over well, they just pull it out of the rotation and say, we weren't committed to it anyway. It's only 3 months. We'll come back with another great idea for our next 3-month league cycle. Okay, so I've got a bunch of wild assertions to throw in here. So first off, on a macro level, there will be no more big edition leagues till after 4.0. This is something that I could be wrong on. Feel free to come back and blast me on this in 6 months if I'm wrong. Leave me a comment down below in the video in 6 months from now, at the beginning of 2020 and at the end of 2019. Iron, you got that wrong and you're the worst predictor in the history of predictors. That's totally fine. But I don't think there will be any more big edition leagues like Delve, like Incursion, or like Bestiary where they're adding a massive side area to the league. Which this also means that I don't think they're going to revamp the lab until after 4.0. I don't think lab's getting touched into 4.0. Maybe they'll do it, but I don't see it happening. I think that would be a big addition or a big quality of life update. Also, another macro thing. Leagues will be focused on mechanics in the zone rather than taking us out of the zone. So many things over the last year have been focused on taking us out of the zone. So many players are complaining about focus, about attention span, about agency, as well as about simply, free to actually interact with the zone rather than having to think about, oh man, what other side things do I need to be thinking about while I'm entering into the zone, whether that's a map or whether that's a story area. People just want to focus on the thing that they're focused on in the moment. And so I think leagues are going to be more geared towards that in 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, and 3.10. Also, trade will get an update via a new league mechanic. I think this is going to happen. So those of you that are saying, wait, Iron, I thought you just said there's going to be no more big additions, and I thought you just said that there's going to be no leagues that pull us out of the zone. I think the trade is going to get an update via a new league mechanic, but it's not going to be a big, massive league mechanic that's like an auction house or something like that. I think they will slowly roll out different updates for quality of life for trade. I'm not going to get into all the details of that. I've talked at length about the auction house, so I'll link that video for you to check out if you haven't seen that video on our long and lengthy discussion about the auction house. But I think that trade is actually on the chopping block when you think about different mechanics that they've been updating over the last several years. I think that trade is one of the things that's going to happen, not necessarily in totality. I don't think we're getting a brand new trade system. I think that if something like that were to happen, that would be 4.0. But I think there will be updates to the trade into trading systems over the course of the next couple of leagues. I also think on a micro level there will be less old skill updates after 3.7 when you consider that all of the spells got touched in 3.6 and probably most of the melee stuff is getting touched in 3.7. Then when you're looking at it, you're like, okay, so maybe like ranged attack stuff can get messed with, maybe auras can get messed with. There's really not a wide variety. Maybe there's like a totem league where they go and they mess with totems, but there's really not a whole bunch of skills for them to really hype up or just dive into on the same scale that they have revamped spells and are projected to revamp melee. So I think there will be less just in comparison to 3.6 and 3.7. It doesn't mean that they will stop altogether, but it just means in comparison with 3.6 and 3.7, there will be less old skill updates. Also, on a micro level, I think Scion is going to get a revamp over the next couple of leagues. Scion, every league and every time the passive tree gets messed with and every time an ascendancy gets changed in any way, shape, or form, Scion gets a little bit of a tweak in and of itself because, you know, its attached ascendancy that it can go for is getting tweaked, buffed, nerfed, etc. So I think Scion in and itself is going to get some attention over the next several leagues, just on its own, whether or not that's, you know, around the passive tree of its own starting area, or whether or not that's, you know, particularly addressing ways in which the Scion functions as an ascendant. I think that Scion in some way is actually going to get a revamp over the next couple of leagues. Almost every other ascendancy has gotten some kind of major rework or revamp, and so I think Scion is due for it. And because Scion is the jack of all trades, I don't think they could really do a Scion revamp in the middle of revamping spells and in the middle of revamping melee. I think they had to wait for those things to be done before they can really revamp the Scion. So that's why I think that's coming down the road. So that's what I thought about future projections beyond 3.7, but what do you think? So what do you think GGG will do on a macro level for leagues and for major game mechanics? Feel free to leave us a comment down below. I always love to read what you guys have got cooking inside your brains and reading what it is that you think is going to happen. So I'd love to hear what you think on a macro level for leagues and for themes for major game mechanics. What do you think GGG is going to do beyond 3.7? Also, what do you think they're going to do on a micro level for skills, for uniques, for cards, and for quality of life improvements, whether that's trade improvements, whether that's cards? Are they going to continue to release cards at a massive rate? Are they going to do a prophecy revamp at some point? Do you think that maybe the lab enchantment isn't that big of a deal, and maybe that'll be something that's more of a quality of life thing that comes out over the next couple of leagues? It could be. It could be. That I don't think it will. I think that's more of a major thing, but I've been wrong before. Iron, you're wrong every single day. I've been wrong before. I'm going to be wrong again. Let me know down in the comments what you think on a micro level for skills, uniques, cards, and other quality of life improvements like prophecy or like lab. And then our last discussion question for the day. What changes or additions to the game do you want to see over the next year? So one of the things that I would like to see over the next year, I know it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen until 4.0. It just won't. I know it's not going to happen until 4.0 if it ever happens. I would love to see more ascendancies. I love playing different characters and building different characters in Path of Exile. I started out as an altaholic, even though I just played summoners. I just built all sorts of different summoners when I first started playing the game. And so I would build one and then would go back and would start a new one. I love doing that, and so I would love to have more ascendancies to pursue. I'm getting close to my goal of having one different type of character at level 80 or above, one of every ascendant in standard, one of every ascendancy sorted in standard. And so I'm getting close to that goal, so I would love to see more ascendancies for me to pursue and chase down and learn about. But I don't think it's not happening. That's like a pipe dream. It's not happening until 4.0 if any of that happens. But what changes or additions do you want to see over the next year? Leave us a comment down below. And as always, I hope today is the day a Mirror of Calandra drops for you right after you get done watching this video.
Nice patrons, yes, good patrons. They're so kind and supportive.
I can't believe you watched that thing. That was a good job. You did it. You got through the whole video. Yay.